Welcome to the Rural School Voices podcast with the Association of Illinois Rural and Small Schools, live on AM 1330, FM 95.7, and on demand wherever you get your podcasts. Here we celebrate rural schools, the educators that serve them, and the communities where they thrive. I'm your host, Karli Strom, and I'm very excited to welcome you to the first episode of our podcast with the most appropriate first guest that we could have, David Ardrey. And Mr. Ardrey is now in his 14th year as the executive director of the Association of Illinois Rural and Small Schools. Dave first got a start in education advocacy as a special education teacher and a coach. Before joining AIRSS, he served as the Director of School Partnerships and Outreach at Southern Illinois University Carbondale. He was also a founding member and first chairman of the Rural Schools Collaborative, and he's committed over a decade serving the National Rural Education Association and their foundation. And in September of 2024, he was selected to serve as the interim executive director for the NREA. So, welcome, Dave. We're super excited to be starting this podcast and obviously having you as our first guest. So, how you doing?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me, Karli. Really excited about the opportunity to be a part of a podcast. As I shared, not particularly my background or, what I would be the most comfortable with, but I'm excited that you and our team have decided to do this.
Yeah, looking forward to more episodes, but we'll get into a little bit first of just, tell me about AIRSS. I think a lot of people don't know who we are, what we do, even though we've been around for so long. So what is AIRSS? What are the pillars that make our organization what it is?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this year we're celebrating our 40th year in existence, actually, as a chartered organization. In the early 80s, a group of people really started to pay attention to Illinois policy as it related to consolidation. And really, over the last 50 years, consolidation comes about every transition of a governor. So a new administration looking for ways to streamline government or change something, it seems that schools were always the target. So that conversation happened about every 4 years. And that was the beginnings of the organization. So there's really kind of a three-segment part of the organization. Kind of that 10-year period focused on consolidation, really fighting the idea of consolidating rural districts. There's really two things to remember about a rural community. One, if you take the school away from the community will die. And it will die proportionately, but it will die. And then I always heard that the hardest animal to kill in a community is the school mascot. And so schools don't want to give up their identity. They don't want to give up that school mascot and that history. And then you get to the middle section of our work as AIRSS, probably in especially mid-90s or early 90s to 2000s, really a lot of research was being done about and around rural schools. So who are they? What do they look like? What's the data tell us about schools? And then I came on board 14 years ago at a time when the board had made a decision to focus on advocacy and legislation and policy. And really, for us, the only way to support and protect schools is to make sure that bad policy and legislation doesn't pass and good policy and legislation does pass. And so we've spent the last 14 years focused on that work, along with support, access to high quality education. So career technical education, looking at opportunities for schools to have better curriculum, access to the same quality of education that other districts in Illinois are afforded.
Absolutely.
And so that's kind of an overview look at the organization. Really the last 6 years have been heavy policy and legislative lift. Evidence-based funding model and seeing that come to fruition. The passage of the Rural Education Advisory Council, only one of two in the United States. An organization that is directly a part of the State Board of Education. And then lastly and recently, the passage of a definition of rural schools in the state of Illinois. Possibly one of only a handful of states that actually have a State Board of Education definition now of who rural schools are.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about the Rural Education Advisory Council, because I think that's something very unique in the work of AIRSS, but also maybe something that people don't know about. And then also within that, having a rural definition now.
Sure.
Why was that so important for Illinois, but also just overall nationally for each state to kind of have their ideas of rural? Why is it important to do something like that?
Yeah, I think the thing to start with is to remember, and I talk about this often, is that we are an urban-centric state that is predominantly rural. And we're identified, or we're connected to the notion of Chicago. Oh, you're from Illinois, you must be from Chicago.
Yep.
Oh, where are you from? Chicago? And the reality of it is that Illinois is about 91% rural agriculture land mass. That's the first moniker. The second one is that nearly 500 school districts are defined by rural, town, or small school districts in the state of Illinois. So over half are rural. So that context is important to understand. This is not a downstate or a central state or a central west issue. This is a statewide issue. There are rural districts throughout the entire state of Illinois. And I always tell a story. If you stay in Chicago downtown and you look south down 57, and you can look on a clear day and see about 12 miles south, there's a massive red barn right in the heart of the city of Chicago. And so it really tells us the story of Illinois. Illinois is a rural state that saw a city grow much like other states. We compare ourselves to California and Los Angeles and New York and Texas and Dallas, San Antonio, Austin. But we truly are a rural state. And so the reason the Advisory Council was so important to us is having a voice cemented in legislation allows us to share the rural issues directly to the state agency. And we don't have to re-educate them every time you change governors and every time you change state superintendents. And so with that direct line voice, we meet on a quarterly basis with the agency's senior staff and the state soup. We talk about issues that affect our rural districts. We talk about things that are happening, both positive and negative, but there's no buffer between that information. That's a direct line of communication to the state board. And so as we developed that opportunity and that passed, you really passed through the policy work that we were doing and legislation, we then realized it would be important to come to an agreement on what is a rural school in Illinois. Some people didn't see the value of that. They felt like it was obvious. Like, if you're rural, you're rural. If you look out your back door and you see farms, you're rural.
Yeah.
But the reality is, at the federal level, there's some data sets called locale codes, and they define all schools throughout the entire country. And they define urban, suburban, rural, town. So that definition existed at the federal level. That really didn't make its way to the state level, really at where we needed it.
Yeah.
Much of federal funding is based upon locale codes. Much of grant funding is based upon both the locale codes, but also based upon rural and based upon poverty. And so as those grants were being distributed, we started to see a disparity of funding to rural districts because it was hard for them to be identified. They were being lost, if you will, in the data set. So the definition now is very clear, and the definition provides a very specific definition of rural schools in the state of Illinois, and now at the federal and state, and honestly, even at the nonprofit grant level making, we now have an identity of where we can work from.
Yeah, I find it very interesting, the kind of, not argument or maybe kind of pushback of, well, if you're rural, you're rural. You know you're rural. The amount of people that, even growing up in a small town myself, I've now had the opportunity within this job to visit towns much smaller than my own, but also growing up, visiting other places. If I would have never left this community, I would have been like, yeah, this is just a town. This is like the big city, or like Galesburg is the big city. So the notion that people should just know that they're rural, I find that very interesting because you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah. I think too there's a bit of an identity crisis that occurs in that there has been a negative connotation purported to rural communities.
Absolutely.
So, oh, you're from rural.
Yeah.
Oh, you live in a poverty-stricken community. Oh, you live in a place that doesn't have a lot of services. And so rural communities who are proud of their communities, proud of their identity, had a tendency to not talk about being rural.
Mm-hmm.
They preferred to just know they were rural, live in the community, but they didn't really express that publicly.
Mm-hmm.
Part of that was, don't really come visit us. We're happy without you here. We're also happy that we have the quality of life that we have. The rural way of life is a quality of life issue. Interestingly enough, during the pandemic, we saw a migration of people out of urban areas into rural places for safety,
Mm-hmm.
for protection. Interestingly, COVID drove people to communities they had never been to, and then they stayed.
Yeah.
Then they found the quality of life that they'd been looking for. So I think that's another part of it, that the communities themselves would prefer to quietly go about their life.
Yeah, that makes sense to me too. It's something interesting as well, having gone to like Monmouth College. So I'm still in the town that I grew up in, but having so many new people that I became friends with, or entered like relationships with, and their kind of perspective of, wow, I love it here. Kind of what you're talking about of,
Right.
I never would have thought I would have loved something like this. Or even, one of my very good friends, she's like, I don't know if I want to necessarily be in Illinois, but I really love smaller rural spaces now. Like, I think that is where I want to live. And I'm like, I support that, whatever state you want to live in. So it's been a very fun thing to see other people's experience coming from very urban areas and being like, wow, this is awesome.
Yeah.
So going back into kind of that, the voice of AIRSS, and from your perspective, why in the beginning and still even now is it so important to have this unified rural voice, and having an idea of having rural identity and having kind of a shared identity, so it's not just spread out and scattered?
Sure. Well, on the policy and the legislative side, the state's broken up into all kinds of legislative districts. And that's the congressional map. That's the Illinois map that determines where state reps, state senators reside and who they work for. And so a smaller collective voice, while strong for that area or that region, when you're competing, if you will, or combating at the state level, that small voice sometimes can be very easily lost. It can also be easily diminished. It can easily be pushed aside. But when that voice comes across the gamut of rural Illinois, that voice is louder. That voice is stronger. That voice carries a much more important weight to someone in the legislative area, in the voting. They worry about voters.
Mm-hmm.
And so we talk about the number of voters that reside in rural places. And we talk about students, that they have parents, and that they have sets of grandparents, and they have cousins. That number becomes a larger number when it's a unified and collective conversation. I also think it's just continuing to note and promote that Illinois is a rural state.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. There seems to be a perception that when you say that, there's something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not. There's not anything wrong with that. If you look at the data that talks about our contribution to agriculture in this country, it's a massive number.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at corporate America agricultural entities, they are significant in this state. One comes to mind is ADM.
Yeah.
ADM alone has a massive presence in the state of Illinois, but throughout the world. And so I think that's the piece that's really, really important in a unified voice, is that we are rural, and we are proud of that, and we contribute. And we contribute to the economy, and we contribute to society, and we contribute to the education system. So I think that's the value in a larger voice.
Yeah, I think it's, from my perspective of thinking about rural communities and seeing other people from larger areas or just more population dense areas, like, oh, there's nothing out there. It's just, cornfields. Like, there's nobody working out there, this or that. And I'm like, you don't have any idea the amount of contribution that these rural communities are having to the larger state economy and just everything nationally overall. It's like that's where a lot of the work is done, and it's just not always, as we've said, promoted or highlighted.
Right.
Or people have this connotation of rules not so good, I'm not going to talk about being from somewhere like that, which I love talking to, rural CTE side of things, but talking to educators and students that are very proud to be in the rural districts and very proud to be in the areas and communities that they're in, because it's so heartening to see that people are kind of switching up their mindset a little bit with that.
Right. It's interesting to think about this. Our AIRSS has been around for 40 plus years.
Mm-hmm.
The National Rural Education Association has been around since the early 1900s.
Yeah.
So really, up until modern urban development, everyone born in this country was from a rural place.
Yeah.
And so the generations of people living in urban spaces come from rural roots.
Absolutely.
And I think what happened along the way is they still have those roots, but they've never seen it. They've never been there. They're far enough apart generationally now that they didn't go back to visit grandma or great-grandma. But it is intriguing to me that when urban Illinoisans find rural Illinois, how many of them say, wow, I've found exactly what I've been looking for.
Yeah.
Or I want to come back and visit. Or how do I become a part of these communities?
Yeah.
And so I think it's as much of it's provincialism.
Yeah.
We live and work and play in the place that we live. And we don't venture out much. I talk to Chicagoans all the time that live in the suburbs, and they rarely go to the city.
Yeah.
And I talk to people in the city who rarely go to the suburbs. They just don't do that. And so we as, rural communities, we don't really venture out that far. We really live and reside in the communities of which we live and reside. I always talk about Friday Night Lights. If you want to see the vitality of a rural community,
Absolutely.
drive through a community on a Friday and Saturday night, and the one set of lights that will be on and active are the school gymnasium, the baseball field, or the football field. And the economy is driven by that night. People come in to see the opposing team. They eat in your restaurant. They buy your fuel. They spend money. And so the vitality of those communities are seen in the eyes of the people who live there and live around there. The rest of the week, there's a lot of cooperative effort between rural communities. On Friday night, there's a lot of competitive effort.
Yep.
But it's still a community that's very thriving across Illinois.
Absolutely. I have to say there's a lot of truth to that, because my house is a block away from Sunny Lane, which is where our football field is for our high school. And every Friday night during fall football season, when we hear that, I'm like,
Right.
We got a touchdown. That's cool. And I'm close enough. It's great because I can walk out of my door and literally see it from my driveway. And be like, awesome, cool. Like, this is what's going on. But it is very true. The amount of people that brings in, and also just such a good sense of community. And I think in high school myself, I was like, why are all these people here for all this? And now as an adult, it's like, why wouldn't I be here for this? So I really like that sentiment. And I'll kind of move on to the next portion, which we've talked a little bit, AIRSS is going into its, 40 years of service. And that's a huge milestone. I still think it's been really fun, when people still come up for conferences or this or that. And it's like, who are you? And it's like, oh, we've been around for 40 years. And they kind of are like, what? And it's like, oh, that's really neat. But, when you think back about the work of AIRSS over, the time period before you were part of it, and then, now being a part of it, what are the few things, or maybe one really outstanding thing that you are really proud of within the organization?
Yeah, I think, and this was shared this morning in a conversation with our past president, Dr. Toomey, I think we have elevated AIRSS to an organization that now is recognized not only statewide and not only regionally with other states, but on a national scale. And that is important for Illinois because of the perception of being a Chicago-based state or an urban-based community. And so I think educating our colleagues and friends around the country, I think sharing the work we've done in rural spaces. There was a sentiment early on that it would be difficult for us to make positive progress on behalf of rural in Illinois because of that urban context. And I think what I learned was this. I was always surprised early when I would speak at schools and communities in rural places that how many people didn't really realize they were rural.
Yep.
They lived it, but they didn't contextualize the notion that I live in a rural place and I work on behalf of rural people.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, I would say across the board, we've been successful in the legislative arena and we've been successful in policy. But I think as an organization, we've elevated AIRSS to a place where there are still people that don't know who we are, and there are people that need to know who we are, and that's our job, our responsibility, if you will. But I think overall, the organization now has become a very, very well-respected voice on behalf of rural schools and communities, for that matter, in the state of Illinois. And I think for me, that's probably the thing I'm most proud of. The rest of the work speaks for itself, and we should be proud of it. But I think organizationally now we are very well recognized.
Yeah. And, within your time of being executive director of AIRSS, what have you seen that's changed in the organization, but also maybe just a broader sense of like the landscape of rural education policy within Illinois from where it first started to, we now have a set definition of rural in Illinois. Like this is where we are now.
Yeah, I think what first comes to mind for me is that the people who are responsible for our schools, superintendents, administrators, school boards, families, and students for that matter, they are very, very aware that there is someone advocating on their behalf every day. And in the past, probably they didn't believe that. They probably at times didn't have to believe it because they didn't need us. And oftentimes, organizations like us, advocacy groups, the Red Cross is at its best during a disaster. But the rest of the time, people know the Red Cross, and most people think of the Red Cross as, I need to give blood today.
Yep.
And so they kind of think of AIRSS as we're here, but I didn't really need them, or I didn't know that I needed them. And then as time went on, and we built that reputation, they realized not only do we need them, we have to have them. We have to have them supporting us, looking out for our best interest, supporting our needs that are sometimes different. I think, the difference between rural and urban schools is, rural schools take great pride in local control. They want to make decisions in the best interest of their students at the local level. And we support that. We're part of that voice to say that's probably the most important thing you can allow a school to do is have that local control. So I think that really for me, I would say, other aspects of that include the work we've done and the policy. But I think the looking ahead is the next important part. Like, where do we go the next 40 years?
Yeah.
And what will our role be and what do we need to be prepared for? I think teacher shortages are never going away. I think school funding will always be a conversation. I think the notion of protecting rural places, not just schools, I think protecting rural communities and farm life and rural life is going to be critical. I mean, just my drive from southern Illinois to west central Illinois, I saw hundreds, if not thousands, of acres of farmland being covered with either windmills or with solar. That farm ground under solar becomes non-effective, non-supported farm ground. They're not feeding anyone with that land. So how are we going to feed people? How are we going to support the economy in the food industry? So I think our role will always remain focused on education in schools, but it will broaden out into supporting that community as well and making sure the community's strong and make sure the community thrives.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing. Again, you said that at the very beginning, like, if you kill the school, you kill the community. It doesn't exist anymore. And I think that's something that not a lot of people think about. I think it's like, or it's just, oh, well, a school can never die, and people think that until their school is consolidated, and it's a hard process, and it's interesting to listen to other people's perspectives, and that's where even in my own time of listening to different podcasts and, you know, people going through those educational crises of, okay, what do we do now? Even from like an Iowa to a Wisconsin, this and that, it's difficult, and it's difficult, I think, at times to maybe rally people together to be like, we have this amazing community, this is what we should do about it to protect it. Or sometimes people think it'll still be okay, it's been here for so long.
Right.
So that's what makes it hard.
Yeah, I was so impressed with my drive in today into Monmouth. And we've been very fortunate to have the opportunity to work with the local radio station on this podcast. This is a thriving community. This is a community that's looking back at its history, but forward to its future. And just the town square, the area of which you're driving into, you can sense pride, and you can sense a longevity of continuing to be a part of the landscape. Some communities lose that. Some communities lose it for a variety of reasons, but they lose that idea of longevity. And, you know, someday we just won't be here. Well, that might be true, but you might also be able to have an impact on that. And so I think that'll be a big step in Illinois for its rural schools and communities, is making sure that we don't see the landscape littered with old school buildings that have closed.
Yeah.
And it's funny, there is a landscape of that exists, but it's now deteriorating and disappearing because they've been gone long enough.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? Do we repeat history and see that landscape come back? Or do we stop that and we see these schools thrive and we see them supported? And that goes back to the policy and legislation. We have to make education the priority in the state of Illinois. And we have to fund education as the priority. And when we do that, then these schools thrive, then these communities thrive. So it's really hand in hand.
Yeah. Yeah. We've been talking a lot of kind of this preconceived ideas that people have about rural schools, or even people within their own rural communities. And, you know, maybe not being as, you know, from an outside perspective, again, maybe you contribute some, maybe not as much as I think you do, you know, whereas we know it, being in our position of they're more expansive and resourceful than what people may ever actually realize. So from your perspective of being in your role, what do you wish people, rural or non-rural, understood about rural communities and rural schools?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is that rural schools are extremely resilient. And if you look at the data both, and most people don't like to talk about COVID, like let's move past COVID, and I agree with that. But if you look pre-COVID, post-COVID data sets, what you'll find in rural schools is you'll find graduation rates higher. You'll see a consistency of that. You'll find grade point averages to be a bit higher in rural communities. You'll see typically less truancy. You'll see students that attend school. You'll see districts that support families. You'll see school educators and administrators see their school and their building as family. And we want all of our family to succeed. So you see this coalition of people really supporting. The other thing I think is important is that I think, one, we have to remember poverty is not a learning disability. And there is a perception sometimes that rural kids might not be quite as smart.
Yep.
And maybe they need a little more help. And I want to dispel that by saying, again, that poverty is not a learning disability.
Yeah.
And poverty exists in our communities. It exists in rural, it exists in urban, it exists in suburban. But the labeling needs to stop.
Yes.
So I think that's one important issue for me, to look at our rural communities and understand that. We also know that education is the pathway out of poverty. And so if a student has a good education, has the opportunity to find a space in the working world, they can find their way out of poverty. We also know that the data tells us that this notion of a pipeline to prison from our schools can be mitigated by a better education. We know that health issues for families and children can be mitigated by good education. We know so many of these data sets that tell us that the best thing to stop these issues is a good education.
Yeah.
So it goes back to the notion of that we should make education the priority
Yeah.
in every state, not just Illinois. Having worked at the national rural ed level, I had a chance to see all of the states and talk about these issues throughout the country. It's interesting, rural education throughout the country really face the exact same
Yeah.
problems. It's just geographical to their community.
Yeah.
And people go, oh, it can't be possible in California, and it can't be possible in New York.
Yeah.
It is possible, and it's reality. And by the way, New York has a very significant rural population.
Yeah.
California, outside of major cities, has a significant rural population. I like to talk about that. There's really the 4 or 5 urban-centric rural states.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you look at New York, you look at California, you look at Illinois, you look at Florida, and you look at Texas.
Yep.
And we can point to all 5 of those states with key urban areas, but the state itself is predominantly a rural state, and contributing through the rural economy at a pretty high level.
Yeah.
So I'm always intrigued by those comparisons at times, and really the lack of understanding of
Yes.
what does a rural community really look like.
Yeah. That's been, people asking me like, oh, what do you do? Or giving them examples of, our first conference that we hosted as AIRSS this past April, and talking about our keynote speaker being Christian Jackson, and, coming from a rural California space and really doing a lot of work out there, and people saying, I had so many people looking at me, what are you talking about? California's not rural. And I'm like, it is more rural than what you realize. And then they kind of, some people were kind of quick to, let me look this up, and like, oh, wow, I'd never really have thought about that before. And again, having somebody like Christian coming into a space with a lot of other rural educator from an Illinois perspective, I would have loved to even have asked them maybe in a survey, like, did you have any idea that, this existed in another state? Because again, you don't know what you don't know.
Right. Yeah, it's easy to look out the back door and look at Montana and Arizona and New Mexico and really even Texas to some extent. But it's really easy to look at some of those states and very easily look at it and say, yep, that's rural America.
Yeah.
But what we don't realize is that, first of all, we don't realize all of America was rural until we had the westward expansion.
Yeah.
So we didn't see these massive cities until later in the birth of the country. So really, the whole place was rural. I think it was called the 16th section that was set aside. And a lot of people don't know about this. In every county, the 16th section of land was set aside by federal law to be where the school would be built. And that was throughout the entire United States. So you can actually kind of follow the history of education by following the 16th section in every single state, in every single county. And so it's a baseline for us.
Yeah.
And it says to us, there was a rural school in every state, in every county that it could afford to have one. That's where this started.
Yeah.
So,
well, with that, AIRSS is going to continue to doing the work that it's doing, but are there any things within the next couple years that you're most looking forward to, or maybe is most prominent top of mind for you?
Yeah, I think we're doing now some really good work around the actual education space. So career technical education, pathways work towards having more teachers, more educators that we hope focus on rural communities. We have a new initiative we're working on in the health sciences, and it's really around helping schools prepare students for viable jobs. Having an opportunity to have a career, have an opportunity to have a professional employment opportunity. I think that, the technology boom, which we've actually seen the birth and death of multiple technology booms, which didn't happen in the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
You saw birth and death, and it was one window of time. I think we lost sight of the need for people to work in this country in all sectors.
Yeah.
And so we have shortages in all sectors. I can remember previous governors talking about that. We kept talking about a teacher shortage. They kept talking about an employee shortage. We have an employee shortage in all sectors, whether it's in the trades, whether it's in technology, whether it's in the professional sectors of medicine and education and science. We have an employee shortage. And so we've really got to get back to focused on giving students skills for work, or skills that can be used in the workspace. But we also need to offer them a pathway to take that skill and then improve that skill, improve that career, improve that profession. It's going to be vital, I think, I think the next 10 years are critical. I think the next 2 to 5 years are it's an imperative that we get back to some sort of educational training for employment at all levels, all sectors. So I think for us, that'll be really critical. I think, from the policy and advocacy standpoint, November is around the corner.
Yeah.
So we'll see another election. And then 2 years later, November will be around the corner, and we'll see a federal election for president. I think for us, we have to look out 4 and 5 and 6 years right now to see where will we be and where will education be in the space of the federal government, and then how does that impact the state level education systems. And so I think our folks at the policy and advocacy level will pay very close attention. This November is critical.
Yeah.
It's critical, period. It's not partisan. It's critical to see where will we be in terms of education in the next 2 to 6 years.
Yeah.
And so we'll be paying really close attention to that. I'm looking forward to a little bit of a break. I will step away from the National Rural Education Association Board this year, and so I will fulfilled my obligation, if you will.
Yeah.
And so that will allow me to spend a little more time and focus on state issues. And I've enjoyed the National Rural Ed a lot. It's helped me in the work we do here, but I think it's time for new faces, and the opportunity for me to come back and spend more time on state level issues is going to be really exciting.
Yeah, I think we'll all be looking forward to it. I think kind of selfishly within my own work, thinking about, opening up more pathways and kind of thinking of it from a CTE standpoint makes me very excited to think like, oh, what are all the opportunities that we'll have present for us to be like, oh, we can really nab this and like run with it for students, within all of our rural communities. But with that, I kind of got you going on the air side of things, but this is a question that I want to pose to every guest that comes on, this podcast. And it's, what's one thing you're most excited about for the future of rural education?
It sounds simple, almost tongue-in-cheek, but it's never going away. I mean, there will always be children coming from rural spaces expecting an education.
Yeah.
And we have an obligation to provide that for them. I hope and pray, but I don't think we'll urbanize the entire country. I think there will always be rural schools. They might look a little different. They might function a little different. But I think at the end of the day, there will always be a rural space. Yeah. And I think we have to take that as a serious obligation to be prepared to support those students. I think we have a tendency to look short term. It's funny. We kind of live our lives in these 4-year cycles. because our children live in a 4-year cycle. They get through 4th grade, and now they've moved on. And in most cases, now they're in middle school. So they get that 5 through 8 experience, and guess what? Another 4-year cycle has come to a close. And then we go through high school, and we end up in this end of another 4-year cycle. But I don't think people pay attention to that. I think they take 1 year at a time in the education system as opposed to what's the next 4 years look like. I probably was more ingrained to it because of my involvement in higher ed at one time. And really, that 4-year cycle for a college student now became 5.
Yeah.
Many students stay through 5 years. But the planning has to take place in that 4 to 5 year cycle. And so for me, the work that I've done, I've always tried to look 4 to 5 years out and really look at 2 cycles because it goes so fast. So what will rural education look like in 2036? And what will we have done to make sure it's still viable, it's still relevant, it's still funded, it's still supported, and those children that come to us, we provided them the very best education that we could provide them. And so that's my hope for the future. That's what I look at for the future.
Yeah. Well, that makes me feel real good because that also means that I'll be continuing to work in the rural ed space, hopefully for a long time. I do really enjoy, I'll do a little self-plug of, this was not necessarily what I would have thought I would have been doing when I started school and then graduated and started working, for AIRSS in the rural CTE project. And now I'm like, I couldn't imagine doing anything else. And it's been really wonderful to kind of even see how I've grown and thinking about my rural communities and my rural schools, and also just making me kind of a more informed citizen. I really appreciate it. So thank you for that as well.
Yeah, you bet. It's a nostalgic comment, but it's a wonderful life.
Yeah.
And so for people that can remember where that came from, it's a wonderful life.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thank you for being our first guest in our first episode of, this Rural School Voices podcast with AIRSS. So in general, thank you for tuning in to the Rural School Voices podcast with the Association of Illinois Rural and Small Schools. You can see the AIRSS team coming up at the Illinois Association of School Administrators Conference in Springfield. That'll be September 30th through October 2nd. Please look out for our future episodes airing every third Tuesday of the month, where we'll be continuing to have conversations with rural educators, CTE experts, and, education advocates. And please remember to visit airsedu.org to join AIRSS today and support rural education in Illinois.